So far, we've looked at a number of poems that deal with themes related to family relationships. We focused on the ways in which identity is shaped by our legacy or heritage. We often have to reconcile with the past in order to move on and have a healthy future. We're now going to take a look at some short stories that deal with similar themes. If you recall, in the story Counterparts by James Joyce, the figure Farrington comes home at the end of the story and he finds that dinner is not ready for him. The fire has gone out, his wife has left to go to church, and so he's very upset and he takes out his anger that has built up over the course of the story as he gets chewed out at work. He kind of gets embarrassed and humiliated at the bar or the pub, and so he has this built up anger that he takes out on his son. And that raises issues about whether or not Farrington is a good father. We often think of a father figure as somebody who is a provider and a protector. And he's not much of a provider when he sort of pawns off a watch and spends all of his money on booze to impress his friends rather than bringing that money home for his family. And as a protector, he's supposed to keep his child safe, and instead he's kind of violent and abusive. And so that let's consider that to be one of our short stories on family relationships. Even though the family does not come in to the very end, it does raise issues about why is Farrington the way he is? What was his childhood like? What kind of father did he have? Often, sometimes when people are victims of abuse or bullying, then they become bullies and victimizers themselves. And so we can bring in a discussion about family and identity, even in Farrington, even when discussing Farrington in Counterparts. And we're going to look at another story in a few minutes called Uncle Rock, another story about a young boy trying to consider really what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a father? What is a good father? Does it have to do with physical strength? Does it have to do with money? Or are there other intangible qualities that a father should have? Before we get to that second story about fathers, we're going to look at two stories specifically focusing on the relationship between mothers and daughters. The first one is Two Kinds by Amy Tan, and then we're going to look at Everyday Use by Alice Walker. And Two Kinds is also, as it says in the introduction to Two Kinds, it really is a book about generational and intercultural relationships among women and families. That what we have in Two Kinds is we have a young Chinese girl. She's often known as her nickname is June, and her real name is Jing Mei Wu, Woo. And her mother is an immigrant from China. She was born in China, came over to the United States, and they live in the San Francisco area. The young girl, June, is a first generation American born in America. And so she knows a little Chinese, she knows a little bit about the culture, but there's kind of a kind of a cultural gap where the young girl's mother is really rooted in China and the young girl is really rooted in the United States. And there's sort of a disconnect. They're from two different cultures. And there's also a generational barrier, obviously, where the mother is older and from one generation, and she doesn't quite understand what's going on with the new generation. And of course, the young girl doesn't really kind of understand her mother's generation. There's sort of a generational and an intercultural kind of cultural gap between the mother and the daughter. And so they're trying to have a close relationship, but these generational and cultural differences are kind of affecting their relationship. Okay. So the narrator of the story is the young girl, June, and we can't say automatically that the story is autobiographical, that maybe the daughter is not exactly the same as the author, even though Amy Tan is the author and much of the novel comes from her own experiences. This is not specifically an autobiography. It's a fictional story. All right. So we have the narrator then, not necessarily the author. The narrator is June, the young girl. And she says, "My mother believed you could be anything that you wanted to be in America." And this right off gets us right into the main theme of the story, which is the mother has had a lot of hardship in China. And she left China and came to America to start a new life. And she has all these hopes and dreams for success and prosperity. And she takes all of her hopes and she puts them onto her child. She wants nothing but the best for her child. And so she believes that you can be anything that you want to be in America. Again. And here's an important word, prodigy. This idea of a young girl, a young child who's a prodigy is a young person with so much talent and opportunity and potential. And so the mother is trying to tell her daughter, you can be a prodigy. And for the mother, it says here, America was where all her hopes lay. She had come here in 1949 after losing everything in China: her mother, her father, her home, her first husband. She lost two daughters, two baby girls. She lost all that and came to the United States with nothing. But it says here that she never looked back with regret. There were so many ways for things to get better. So the mom's always looking to the future and saying, you know what? I've lost so much in the past, but now I have a new daughter and there's so much potential. She can be anything that she wants to be. So the mom starts becoming obsessed with like child stars. And one of the probably the first, well, really the first great child star, child actor was Shirley Temple. She was in all kinds of movies. She was famous even as a young girl. And so the mother's like thinking, hey, my daughter can be the next Shirley Temple. She could be a Chinese Shirley Temple. All right. A child prodigy, a young, talented actor. Shirley Temple could sing and she can dance and she could act, and all at a very young age. And so she gets so excited about this that the daughter herself cannot help but get caught up in her mom's excitement. And she says, in the beginning, I was just as excited as my mother, maybe even more so. I pictured this prodigy part of me as many different images. And she says, in all of my imaginings, I was filled with the sense that I would soon become perfect. My mother and father would adore me. I would be beyond reproach. I would never feel the need to sulk for anything. But sometimes the prodigy in me became impatient. All right. So you get the sense, obviously, I don't think the mother is expecting the daughter to be perfect. But the daughter kind of builds up this stuff in her imagination that she's going to be so talented and so successful and so perfect. And so what happens is these expectations are too high and they become something very negative, a very negative force in June's life. Because each time she's expected to perform and as a prodigy, she kind of falls short of expectations. And so here on the screen, you'll see it says, and after seeing my mother's disappointed face once again, something inside of me began to die. She says she hated the raised hopes and the failed expectations. So she goes back and looks in the mirror. And when I saw only my face staring back, and that it would always be an ordinary face, she began to cry. So she doesn't see the prodigy side of herself. She doesn't see the successful part of herself. She just sees the ordinary person facing her in the mirror. And she has very low self image. She says, such a sad, ugly girl. So now she starts to get new thoughts, right? She doesn't like the feeling when her mom hopes for something great. and then she falls short of those hopes, and then she feels like a big disappointment. And this makes me think of that poem about my father in heaven. You remember the young Chinese narrator or persona, the voice of that poem was talking about the fact that his father was this scholar and this great man, and that he always kind of felt like a disappointment to his father. He felt like he did not measure up. And finally, at the end, he sees his father more as a just a regular, ordinary person, and he feels a connection to his father. And we see something very similar going on in the story. So it's always helpful as you go through the literature is try to make connections not only between the stories and poems and plays and the experiences of your own life, but also try to make connections between one work of literature and the other work. As you start making connections between works of literature and you start to synthesize different ideas, you start to get more out of what you're reading, and the whole experience of reading is much richer that way. So just like we want to have different perspectives when we read, looking at different stories from different lenses through different windows, it also helps to try to start making connections between different works. Okay, so it says here, I had new thoughts, willful thoughts, thoughts filled with lots of won'ts. I won't let her change me. I promise myself I won't be what I'm not. So she starts to get this attitude that every time my mother tries to encourage me to try hard, to do my best, to try to make something out of myself, I'm going to resist that. I'm going to be stubborn, and I'm going to kind of resist her pressure on me. I'm going to refuse to let her build up these expectations, these hopes, right? I'm going to aim low, right? So instead of aiming for an A in the class, I'm going to aim for a C minus. And that way, if I get a C minus, I got exactly what people expected. But if I do better than that, people will be, oh, wow, that's great. You got a B or an A, and good for you. But I don't want people to expect the A or to hope for the A, because then I'll end up getting a C and I'll feel like a big loser. So she starts to become very rebellious. Okay. Now we get to the main plot of the story, which is the mom's watching a talent show on TV, a common variety show called the Ed Sullivan Show. You may be familiar with that. If you look it up online, you can see that, like, for example, the famous group, the Beatles, were performed on the Ed Sullivan Show. And she sees this young girl playing the piano, and she sees this little 9-year-old Chinese girl, and she thinks, wow, there's a little 9-year-old Chinese girl playing the piano on Ed Sullivan Show. And she says, oh my gosh, my daughter could do that. So she says, tells her daughter, come over here, look over here. And I could see why my mother was fascinated. It was being pounded out by a little Chinese girl about 9 years old. All right. So you can mark that there. And that mother gets a big idea. So she suddenly just immediately signs her daughter up for piano lessons. Now, they don't have a lot of money. They don't even own a piano, but the mother works as sort of a housekeeper. She cleans homes for a living. So she makes a deal with this man, Mr. Chong, a retired piano teacher, and she says, okay, you lend us your piano and give us some lessons. In exchange for that, I'll provide house cleaning services. And they're going to try to practice 2 hours a day from 4 until 6. But the daughter immediately says she feels like she had been sent to hell. And she makes a good point. Why don't you like me the way I am? If you keep trying to get me to succeed, it's like you're not satisfied with me. You don't care about me as I really am. You're disappointed in me, and so you're trying to get me to be something that I'm not. That's how the daughter perceives it. But the mother doesn't mean this at all. And the mother's kind of surprised by that. The daughter says, why don't you like me the way I am? I'm not a genius. And the mother slaps her for being kind of disrespectful and says, who asked you be genius? Only ask you be your best for your sake. I'm not asking you to be perfect or a genius. I'm only asking that you try your best. All right. So the daughter and mother are having a misunderstanding. They're coming at the same situation and not really understanding each other. Now we find out some interesting information. Kind of funny is that old Chong, the piano teacher, doesn't have very good hearing. He says he's deaf like Beethoven. And so when the young girl June is practicing her piano, she's not very good. She's kind of hitting wrong notes and missing stuff. She doesn't even like really try, but she gets away with it because Mr. Chong, old Chong, can't really tell what she's playing anyway. So she picked up the piano pretty fast, and she realizes that if she actually would have cared or tried, probably could have been pretty good at the piano. But of course, she's kind of going out of her way to suck at it. She does not want to be good at it. It's her form of rebellion. Now we're introduced to an important friend of the mother. Uh, they call her Auntie Lindo. They're not technically an aunt, just a good friend of her mother. They're friends. A bunch of these women met in a church group, and Lindo Zhang is one of her mom's best friends. Then Lindo Zhang has a daughter named Waverly, and Waverly is also like a little prodigy. She was like a chess champion and sort of a famous chess champion. Everybody in the community knew about Waverly. And so you get the sense that the two mothers are having like a friendly competition, like whose daughter is better than whose. And I love this scene. This cracks me up right here, like next to section 45 here. Paragraph 45 cracks me up because the moms find these little subtle ways to kind of brag about their kids and insult the other person while at the same time maintaining this kind of friendly face, right? She says, Auntie Lindo says, "Oh, my daughter brings home so many trophies all day long. She just doesn't do anything. All she wants to do is play chess. I'm sorry, chess. And I have no time to do anything, but all I do is dust off. I have to go through the house and take all the dust off all her trophies." And she says, "It's so much work to dust off all these trophies. You're so lucky that you don't have this problem. You're so lucky that your daughter has won no trophies because you don't have to go through all the trouble of dusting them." So it's just such a little dig into bragging about her daughter and sort of putting down June, right? June's name is Jing Mei, right? And so the mom says, June's mom says, "Our problem worser than yours. If we ask Jing Mei wash dish, she hear nothing but music. It's like you can't stop this natural talent." This is completely baloney, right? Completely exaggerating and showing off. So of course the daughter says, "Right then I was determined to stop her foolish pride. I'll show her. She wants to brag about me. I'll make her regret it." Now, this is going to come back later. I'll discuss a little bit more detail in a minute, but in paragraph 50 here, it's very interesting that the piece of music that she starts to play for her piano recital is called Pleading Child, and it's from Schumann's Scenes from Childhood. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that the author has chosen this as the title of the song, because in a sense, not Waverly, June or Jing Mei, she is a pleading child. She's pleading for something. She wants unconditional love. She wants her mom to accept her for who she is. Now the mom does accept her for who she is, right? But she loves her too much to leave her that way. She wants to encourage her to keep trying her best so she could have more success. So the young girl becomes the pleading child, and this is a scene from her childhood. This whole piano recital story is a scene from her childhood, and she herself is the pleading child. So this is going to come back at the end of the story, but just file that piece of information away for now, that story is called Pleading Child. So now it's time to perform. Oh, by the way, it mentions right here in the story in a couple places. It mentions that the women, the four women, are friends, and they have a kind of a social gathering called the Joy Luck Club. And I want you to know that this short story here, Two Kinds, is not really a short story. It's an excerpt from a novel. They've taken this part of the story out of a novel. The novel is called the Joy Luck Club. And this story, Two Kinds, is a part of that novel. It's an excerpt. And they've just kind of lifted this part of the novel and put it in as a standalone story called Two Kinds. So think of that Joy Luck Club, and that term joy and luck, it's where the mothers all come together and share stories about their experiences. All four of these women are immigrants from China, and they all share their experiences and their hope for their happiness and prosperity of their children. And so that's why they call their club, translating into English, the Joy Luck Club. Now, when it gets to the time for the big show, um, Xing Mei is kind of like overconfident. I'm going to get out there and I'm going to go and perform. But as she started to play, everything kind of falls apart. She starts hitting wrong notes, then more wrong notes, and she goes through the song, and it's not good. And she's sweating up there, and she's realizing that she's completely losing it, and it's a complete disaster. And the whole community's there watching this piano recital. And when she's done, the room is like deathly quiet. They're all like stunned. They don't know what to do. It's just such a terrible performance that the crowd does not know what to do. The only person that gets up and starts clapping and cheering is old Chong, because of course he can't tell what she played. He can't even hear very well. So he says, "Bravo, bravo, well done." But it's very interesting. Notice the reaction of the mother. The mother is very embarrassed. She wants everybody, she's so proud of her daughter, and she wants the community to all share in her daughter's success. And yet they're all sitting there and watching her completely, a complete train wreck of her performance. So the audience claps very weakly, trying to be polite. And some little kid, little boy, whispers to his mom, "That was awful." And the mother whispers back, "Well, she certainly tried." Well, here's the idea, is that she didn't really try. She never really practiced. She didn't really try. And so she said, and now I realized how many people were in the audience. It seemed like the whole world was looking at me. And all I could feel was the eyes of my mother, right, burning into my back. I felt the shame of my mother and father as they sat through the rest of the show. Okay. Now we see really quickly the other women, Mrs. the Sues, the Zhongs, and the St. Clairs. These are the other three women, along with Jing Mei's mother, are the four women from the Joy Luck Club. Okay, so just remember that this is from a novel. Now, of course, Waverly, her friend here, is having a ball. She loves it. She just thought it was the greatest thing to watch um, her just fall apart during the performance. And she's very sarcastic, and she says, "Boy, you're a genius like me." And she kind of wants to punch her in the face. But my mother's expression, she says, devastated me. A quiet, blank look that said that she had lost everything. And I felt the same way. But she's kind of waiting for her mom and dad to chew her out so she could then go off and start yelling at them like, "You're the one who forced me to play the piano. I didn't want to do it." So it's all, so she's ready for a fight. But what does she get when she gets home? No accusations, no blame, and she feels very disappointed. She said, "I've been waiting for her to start shouting so that I could shout back and blame her, but the mom's completely quiet." So she thinks everything's blown off. She doesn't have to play the piano anymore and everything's good. But then when the next time for the piano lessons come in, she's like, "Okay, time to practice." And the daughter's like, "I don't want to practice." And here's a very important scene. I would mark this passages around paragraph 75 to 80, right around this area. Mark this. This is very important because she says, "You want me to be someone that I'm not. I'll never be the kind of daughter that you want me to be." And the mother says there's only two types of daughters, obedient daughters and ones who follow their own mind. Obedient and disobedient. Those are the only two daughters. And only one kind of daughter can live in this house, and that is an obedient daughter. So then daughter says, "Well, then I wish I wasn't your daughter. I wish that you were not my mother." So that's kind of a very hurtful thing when parents, they love their kids and give everything they can for them. Then the kid looks them in the face and says, "I hate your guts and I wish you were not my parent." So she shouts the most hurtful thing she can. "I wish you weren't my mother." So she's feeling powerful at this point. I'm going to let my mom have it. And the mother's very hurt, and she says, "Well, it's too late to change this, right?" Um, Now remember, the mother has, and in the novel we figure out more of the details, but the mother has had to leave these two twin girls behind in China. She left her whole life behind in China, and now this young girl has all these advantages in America, and she's screaming at her mom like, "I wish you weren't even my mom." And the mother's very hurt and says, "Well, it's too late to change that." She says, and that's when I remembered the babies she had lost in China, the ones that we were never supposed to talk about. And she says, then I wish I had never been born. I wish I were dead like them. And she knows that that's the big button. That's the nuclear button. She knows the most hurtful thing she could possibly say to her mother was that she wished she were dead like her. Now, we find out later that the two babies are not dead. The mother had to leave them and she thought they were dead. And we find out later that the two girls lived in China and grew up. And the main character goes back to China to visit and to meet them. But but she goes to the most painful part of her mother's life and says, I wish I were dead like the babies. And she says, it was like I had said the magic words, alakazam. And it's like I had just shot her or punched her straight in the face. And she's so hurt by that that the mom never says another word about piano again. All right. So here we then in paragraph 79, 80, we jump in time and says, over the years, she said, I just failed over and over again. I like failed on purpose. I did not get straight A's. I did not become class president. I did not get into Stanford. Now, there's always a stereotype about this, but it's a common experience that many Asian Americans experience where education is very important and kids are encouraged to go to Berkeley or some university, do well in school, get a good job. And she says, I tried to make sure I did the opposite of that. I even dropped out of college. So, unlike my mother, I did not believe that I could be anything I wanted to be. I could only be me. So what happens is, says I never found a way to ask my mother why she had hoped for something so large that failure was inevitable. It seems cruel for a parent to hope for something for their kids that is impossible for them to achieve. All right. And so it's like if I want my child to be the greatest sports star ever, I want you to be the next LeBron James or the next whatever great athlete. And you're putting all that hope on them and they're never going to reach that. And so if failure is inevitable, then why are you putting that hope on there? So she never had a chance to ask her mother that, right? And so it says, even worse, I never asked her what frightened me the most. Why had she given up hope? So it's interesting. She was upset for her mother for hoping too much. So the mother got hurt and stopped hoping altogether. And maybe the daughter's like, I'm not asking you. I want somewhere in the middle. Not too much hope, not too little hope. Can't you think of the right amount of hope for a child? So so she's very surprised later on when the young woman now grows and she's now 30 years old. And on the 30th birthday, the mother says, hey, I'm going to give you the piano. You can have it. It's your piano. And so the daughter takes this as sort of like a chance to forgive and to heal. I saw it as a sign of forgiveness, but she didn't take the piano. She kept it at her parents' house. And she said every time I saw it there, it made me feel proud as if it were a shiny trophy that I had won back. So she feels that her mother has finally kind of had a reconciliation, that they've kind of healed their own wounds, and now things are good again. But then the mother dies, and she comes back to help her father kind of go through her mom's jewelry and things. And she sees the piano, and she goes over to look at the piano. And notice it's very interesting. It says, I opened up the Schumann book, and saw that piece there, the pleading child. And something interesting, it says that the piece looked more difficult than she remembered. But then she notices something, and she either forgot it or she never really paid attention, that on the other side of the page, there was another piece of music called Perfectly Contented. And notice where the pleading child was difficult, the Perfectly Contented song was easy. And I love the last line here. It says, pleading child was short but slow, and Perfectly Contented was long but fast. And after I played them both a few times, I realized they were two halves of the same song. So you see here is that, she's a pleading child longing for something for her parent, from her mom in this case. And then Perfectly Contented is when you kind of learn to accept your parents for who they are. You come to find some type of mutual understanding, and you kind of fix a broken relationship. And so she is at this point perfectly contented. So you have a short time in life when you're a child. It's a short time, but seems to go slow. And then as an adult, you have a long amount of time as adult, but it seems to go faster. And maybe that's how I'm kind of picking up on the idea of this, the short and slow and difficult childhood, and the long and fast and easy adulthood. That's how I'm kind of reading the kind of symbolism or meaning of these two halves of the same song. Right, so I really like that. I really like the novel, but you what you I really recommend is if you can get the movie and watch Joy Luck Club. It's really well done, and it's a great adaptation of the novel. So I really recommend watching the movie, The Joy Luck Club. Now, very similar, similar themes, but in Alice Walker's Everyday Use, we have a young woman who is African American, not Chinese, and and of course these black women for generations have lived in the United States. They've been here for 100 years or so. So there we don't have a situation where one parent is an immigrant to a new country, but they do seem like the mother and the daughter Dee do seem like they're from different worlds. And so we have a situation here where you've got a mother who is poor, and she's uneducated, and she's extremely hardworking. And she has two daughters, Maggie and Dee. Now, poor Maggie has been kind of damaged. There was a fire at the home, and Maggie was sort of severely burned. Her clothes were on fire, her skin was scarred and burned and became scarred. Maggie is not very bright in some sense. She doesn't do a lot of reading. She doesn't do well in school. Uh, and so Maggie is a lot like her mother. Uh, the mother and Maggie are kind of like two peas in a pod, whereas Dee is much different. So we start off trying to think about the mother and the comparison between the two daughters. So the mother starts off with like a fantasy. She's imagining, like, she sees these shows where somebody goes on a talk show, and on the talk show, they talk about how great their mother was and how they owe everything to the mother. So she says, you've no doubt seen those TV shows where the child who has made it, some like actress, some famous actress, is confronted as a surprise. They surprise her like out from behind the screen. The mother and father come out, and they all start crying. And they all talk about, oh, my mother and father were so great. I couldn't have done anything without them. I'm so grateful. So she says, sometimes I dream a dream in which Dee and I are suddenly brought together on a TV program, and I'm ushered into a bright room filled with many people. There's like a talk show host like Johnny Carson up there, and he shakes my hand and tells me what a fine girl I have. And Dee is there embracing me with tears in her eyes. But notice the contrast in paragraph 5. But then I get back to reality, And in reality, I'm a large, big boned woman with rough, man working hands. I wear flannel nightgowns to bed. I can kill and clean a hog. My fat keeps me hot in zero weather. I can work outside all day breaking ice to get water for washing. I can eat pork liver cooked over the open fire minutes after it comes off the hog. Once I knocked a bull calf straight in the brain between the eyes with a sledgehammer. So she's a rural environment farming. She's a outdoor kind of person, and she comes across as being very strong, very rough, very crude. So she's contrasting her fantasy with her reality. And she knows that her daughter's probably, Dee is probably ashamed of her. She wouldn't want her mother to be on TV. She'd think everybody laugh at her for being so old fashioned and so uncultured and so ignorant. Now, the plot here is that Dee has gone off to college and she's coming home to visit. And notice on paragraph 10 it says Dee is lighter than Maggie, with nicer hair and a fuller figure. How long ago was it that Maggie had, when the house had burned? 10, 12 years ago? Sometimes I can still hear the flames and feel Maggie's arms sticking to me, her hair smoking and her dress falling off her in little black papery flakes. Her eyes seem stretched open, blazed open by the flames reflected in them. So you see the contrast and pay attention to that. Maggie's had kind of a tough childhood, and everything seems to go great for Maggie. She's beautiful, she's intelligent, she's she has avoided the damage from this fire, and she's gone off to college. There's even a little racial element here when we see that Dee is lighter skinned than Maggie. So even this in the African American community, this idea of Maggie being lighter skinned and having nicer hair shows another kind of sense in which Dee is more likely to go out into the larger society and to succeed in it, where Maggie seems to be left alone back at the house. Okay, so they sent her off to school and said that Dee wanted nice things. Dee wants a better life. She doesn't want to sit around in some old shack in the middle of a field. She hates her background. She hates the house. She hates the poverty. She hates the work. She wants to have a better life. But notice the mother says here, I never had an education myself. After second grade, the school was closed down. So the mother can't even really read very well. And so Maggie kind of reads to her, and Maggie's not very good at reading either. And Maggie's going to be about ready to get married to a young man named John Thomas. And she says, then I'll probably just be here by myself, probably just singing church songs and nothing else to do. And so she thinks when Maggie gets home and sees this new house out here in the pasture, she's probably going to want to tear it down too. She's going to hate this house. She once wrote that no matter where we choose to live, she will manage to come see us, but she will never bring her friends. So it's very odd when she shows up, she has an attitude that the mother does not expect. And she shows up with this young man, and she's dressed, she says, a dress down, she has a dress down to the ground. And so this is a part of a thing where kind of the Dee is getting in touch with her African roots, and so she's taken on some of the clothing and jewelry and so forth that is from her African culture. So you can again picture this sort of very colorful dress. And this she said, man, there says it's so loud it hurts my eyes. There are yellows and oranges. I feel my whole face warming from the heat that this dress is throwing out. and big earrings of gold hanging down to her shoulders, bracelets, and so forth. The dress is loose and flows as she walks, and she says, I like it. So she's changed her whole way of dressing. Her hairstyle is different, her dress is different. She's trying, in a sense, Dee has tried to transform her entire identity, getting in touch with her African roots and finding an identity. And so she comes up speaking Wazu So Taneo, and then this boyfriend that she's with, whatever, says, Assalamu alaikum, my mother and my sister. So they're speaking differently, and the mother doesn't even know what that even means. And then Maggie starts pulling out a camera and starts taking all these photographs. And she's taking photographs of the house and the pasture and the mom and her sister and the cows and stuff. And it seems different. Remember, the mother was thinking that Dee hates the house, and but she comes over. She can't get enough of the house. She's taking all kinds of photographs of everything. So the mother says, "Okay, well, Dee," and the mother, and then Dee interrupts her and says, "No, I don't. It's not. My name is not Dee anymore. It's Wangero Liwanika Kimanjo." And the mom's like, "What happened to Dee?" And then the daughter says, "Well, she's dead. I couldn't bear it any longer being named after people who oppressed me." So she says, "I don't want a slave name. I want to go back and take an African name and take pride in my African heritage. And I don't want to take a name from slavery." And the mom's kind of confused. She says, "Well, you were named after, what do you mean people who oppress you? You were named after your Aunt Dee, Big D." And then she says, "But who was Big D named after?" And Ma says, "Well, I guess after Grandma D." "Well, who was she named after?" So, and then she's like, "Well, her mother," I said, and I saw that she was getting tired. "Well, that's about as far back as I can trace it," I said, "though I probably could have carried it back beyond the Civil War through the branches." So it's a name that's been passed on a lot through the family, but uh, but Dee is trying to say that it's a slave name, and so she's rejecting it and taking on a new name. She's trying to find a new identity, and that raises the important theme of this story, which is how do you find an identity by denying your own family? It seems like who your parents and grandparents and great grandparents and great grandparents, these are the people who that really shape your identity. So she's trying to like erase like 200 years of history and go back and try to find identity before slavery in the United States. And so the author Alice Walker is trying to get at some potential problem here when you're trying to get a sense of your own identity, but you're erasing decades or even hundreds of years of your own family heritage. There's something wrong about that. So she's talking about they have all these new African names. They're so long that the mother cannot even pronounce it right. Now, all of a sudden, if you get to paragraph 45, Dee is so excited about everything. She looks at the benches that the dad made. She's all excited about that. Oh, how great these benches are. And then she wants to have this the churn top. She wants that. She wants to take the dasher. She wants to take it home with her. It's like, what are you gonna do with that? She says, well, I can use the churn top as a centerpiece for the table, and I think I'll think of something artistic to do with the dasher. So what's going on here is she's almost treating her house as though a museum. She's bringing it back, going, "Oh, look, here's the little pasture and the small crappy house, and here's the little bench that my dad made, and here's the butter churner." And she wants to take these things back to her home and use them as like artistic pieces or decorations. She wants to decorate her apartment with little items from her heritage or from her past. And then she goes into the room and she comes out with these quilts that were made by Grandma D and Big D, and all these women have made these quilts using these traditional patterns like the Lone Star pattern and the Walk Around the Mountain pattern. And they use different scraps of dresses and uniforms. And so the quilts are like museum pieces. And D, Wangero, she says, "Can I have these old quilts?" And the mother's like, "Well, why don't you take these other ones?" And she's like, "I don't want those. Those are like sewn with the sewing machine. I want these hand stitched quilts." And the mother's like, "Well, the truth is, I promised to give them to Maggie, right? She's going to get married to John Thomas, and I was going to give her these quilts as sort of a wedding gift." And Dee is stunned by that. She goes, "You can't give them to Maggie. Maggie can't appreciate the quilts. She'd probably be so backward, right? She's backward enough to put them to everyday use." And there is the title there in paragraph 66. That's the title of the short story, Everyday Use. She says Maggie would take those quilts and she'd actually use them. Can you imagine? And mom's like, doesn't know what she's talking about. Of course she's going to use them. That's what I've been saving them for. I was saving them. Nobody wants them, but you don't want them. So I tried to give them some to you when you went off to college, and you told me they were old fashioned and out of style. And then all of a sudden Dee says, "But they're priceless." Maggie would put them on the bed. In 5 years, they'd be in rags, right? So all of a sudden she's gone from thinking they're old fashioned, and now she thinks they're priceless. And Dee's like, she's going to use them and then she's going to ruin them. And then the mom says, "Well, who cares if she ruins the quilts? She could always make some more because Maggie knows how to quilt." And there in line paragraph 70, I really want you to focus on that because that's the important part here, which is that who is in touch with the heritage, who has a deeper connection to the family heritage, Dee or Maggie? Dee is learning about African culture. She's learning all kinds of ideas about um, Black pride and finding her own a new identity in college. And there's a lot of positive qualities in those discoveries and those transformations. But in something in the process, though, has been lost. She's sort of disconnecting from her own personal heritage. And Matt D wants to take these quilts and use them, just hang them on the wall and treat them like museum or art pieces. Where Maggie is going to actually put them to good use. And Maggie, she actually knows how to quilt. The skill of making a quilt has been passed on generation to generation, and it's been passed on to Maggie. So Maggie knows how to quilt, but Dee does not know how to quilt. So which of these two young women really has a better understanding of their heritage? So the mom's like, "Well, what do you want to do with them?" And then Dee says, "Well, I'm going to hang them," as if that was the only thing you could do with quilts. Now, Maggie jumps in and says, "It's okay, Mom. Dee can have them." Like Maggie's used to getting nothing. She's used to being the loser. She's like, "That's okay. I can remember Grandma D without the quilts. I know how to quilt. She can have them." And we learned that Grandma D and Big D had taught Maggie how to quilt. But the mother's going to draw the line here. She's not having it. She says, "No, no, you can take one of the other ones. I'm not giving you these quilts. You can take some of the newer ones. I'm keeping these and I'm giving them to Maggie." And it's very ironic at the end. She says, "You just don't understand." Now we want to know, who is it that doesn't understand? There is something that Mother and Maggie don't understand, but there's something that Dee doesn't understand either. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You don't have to be just Maggie, and you don't have to be Dee. Maybe there's a way to be combine Maggie and Dee to keep in touch with our own heritage and our own culture and our own family history, but also move on and reinvent and find some new identity at the same time. So it's interesting that Dee is trying to give a lecture. She goes off to college, attends a few classes, and then tries to come home and give her mom and her sister a lecture about their heritage. "You don't understand your own heritage," she said. "You ought to try to make something of yourself," she said to Maggie. "It really is a new day for us, but from the way you and Mama still live, you'd never know it." Right. So it's just a really awesome story. One of my favorite short stories. And just the concept of the quilt. And are you going to hang these on the wall as a museum piece, or are you going to put them to everyday use? And what does heritage and identity really mean. And there maybe you can get the best of both worlds. Find a way to blend Maggie and Dee, and find a way to have a little bit of both. Uh, have a connection to the past, but don't live in the past. Find a way to move on to the future. Okay. Now, the final story, then, so those are our two stories about mothers and daughters. And the final story, we're going to go back to looking at a mother and father. And we've got this story. So it's a new story. Hadn't read it until a couple of maybe a year or two ago. And I really like this story. It's called Uncle Rock by Dagoberto Gilb. And the main character is Eric, and his mom is a single mother. He doesn't have a father. I don't really know from the story. Maybe his father has been out of the picture for quite some time, so he's very used to just being him and his mother. But we get the sense that his mom is pretty sexy. She's probably very beautiful, and men are always coming around trying to seduce her and trying to date her. And Eric is kind of like get tired of it. He says he's at this restaurant eating some favorite American food, sausage and eggs and ham and hash browns and stuff. But then there's always some man that kind of interrupts them. They'll start by just staring at them from across the room. Then eventually somebody will come over to the mother. Then he'd say something about her earrings or bracelet or her hair or eyes, or how nice she looked in the uniform, or how pretty she was. He'd wink at Eric. How old is he? 8 or 9? We find out that he's actually 11 years old at this point, right? And then if the man looked like if he was wearing a nice suit, looked like he was a successful person, the mother would almost always give the man her phone number. So then again, there's a long series of dates where men are constantly coming over. His mom's constantly going out with these men. And it says that Eric just really didn't like to talk very much. He didn't talk to any of the men, and he didn't talk much to his mom either. So then we get a contrast. We see what life was like back in Mexico for the mother. She'd had to share a room with her brothers. They didn't have toilets. They didn't have electricity. Sometimes they didn't have enough food. And so he doesn't have a lot of experience. I get the sense that he has never even been back to Mexico. And so he's got these, like a lot of these images or stereotypes in his mind from movies and so forth of what it's like there. And so you can read this passage here in paragraph 4, this big long passage about this his impression of what her life was like back in Mexico. But in contrast to that, it says he lived on paved, lighted city streets, and a bicycle ride away were Asian drugstore and the Armenian grocery store, where black Cubans drank coffee and talked Dodger baseball. So he's from LA area, and very multicultural, diverse kind of neighborhoods. And so he's a nice little contrast between his mom's experience and his own life. And of course, he loves his mother, but as a young boy, he's trying to identify. He needs sort of a father figure or man to identify with, and there's no real man around. And so he's struggling to figure out, like, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a good father? And so the mom starts dating this engineer, and Eric tells his friend Albert that this engineer is his father. And he even started to believe that too. He thought that his mom's going to get married to this engineer, and that will be his new father. But then finds out that didn't happen. They break up. The mother's all upset. And then a new man starts coming around named Rock. And he says Rock was nobody, or he was anybody. He wasn't special, and he wasn't not special. He's just kind of an average, everyday dude. But now he had already told Albert that Eric was his father, so now he has to call Rock his uncle. So he pretends that his mom has a brother named Rock, so he calls him Uncle Rock, and that's where we get the name of the short story, Uncle Rock. It's not actually an uncle; it's a man who's dating his mother. Now, I love this passage here where he describes and notice Eric trying to understand what makes a good father figure or a good man. And he says, "What if she married Rock?" His mother asked. So she's considering getting married. And so he thinks that Rock doesn't have a swimming pool or horses or a big ranch house. He says there wasn't much to criticize about him except for he was always too willing and nice, too considerate and too generous. He's too nice. He's too sweet. He's always supporting his mother, always being nice to her. He wore nothing flashy or expensive, just ordinary clothes. He didn't have a buzz cut. He moved slow. He talked slow. He only ever said yes to his mom. Right. How could she not like him for that? He loved her so much. Anybody could see his pride when he was with her. So he's not one of these disgusting pigs who's always just coming on to her and trying to get into her pants. This Uncle Rock really genuinely cares for Eric's mother. And he's not a rich guy. He's not a superhero or anything like that. He's just an everyday average person. But he loves Eric's mother and he treats her well. And he's nice to Eric. He was there when she asked and gone when she asked. Back whenever, grateful. He took her out to restaurants, to the movies. He was just a really good boyfriend, and they're considering getting married. And Rock knows that Eric loves baseball, but Eric gets the sense that Rock did not watch baseball. But he did know about Fernando Valenzuela. So I don't know if you know about that, but back in the day, among the Hispanic community in Los Angeles, Fernando Valenzuela, the pitcher for the Dodgers from Mexico, he was extremely good pitcher, very successful, and it was very popular. The Dodgers became very popular with the Hispanic community. People loved to come out and cheer for Fernando Valenzuela. And so even though Uncle Rock is not really into baseball, of course, he does know about Fernando Valenzuela. And he says everybody knew about Fernando Valenzuela. Even his mom knew about that. So maybe that's why she agreed to say, hey, let's go out to the Dodger game. The Dodgers are going to be playing the Phillies. Let's go watch the game. He says, what Mexican didn't love Fernando? Dodger Stadium was close to their apartment. So they're going to go to the Dodger game, right? And they're going to play the Phillies, but of course Uncle Rock doesn't know anything about the Phillies. There are all kinds of famous players on the Phillies back in the 70s, and so Steve Carlton, Mike Schmidt, Pete Rose, these are all famous baseball players, right? Now Eric is really excited to go to the game. He's never been to the Dodger game before, and for him, he says the green of the field was like a magic light, and the stadium decks surrounding them seemed as far away as Rome. It's like he's coming into the Forum or the Colosseum, I mean to say, the Colosseum of Rome. So it's a kind of a magical experience. They kind of got there late in the game as they're coming to their seat. A home run ball, that ball is hit out to the stands. And it's funny, you can go to a baseball game like 20, 30 times and never catch a ball. Eric, like the first second he shows up, he catches a home run ball. I mean, he puts his hand up and goes right into his hand. And everybody watches him catch the ball without even bobbling the ball, right? He's not sure who hit it. It may have been hit by Pete Guerrero or somebody like that. But he couldn't even really concentrate on the game at that point. He just looked at his ball and he had a hot dog and a soda, salted peanuts, uh, a malted ice cream, and he just sat there eating the food, hanging out with his mom and Uncle Rock, looking at his ball. And then it's time to leave the game. One of the Phillies comes out of the stadium, and everybody runs over there trying to get autographs. And then somebody opens up the window to the team bus and says to Eric, "Hey, big man, give me the ball. I'll have it signed." Right? And he's not sure if Eric even understands English, so he peppers in some Spanish. But he says, "Throw that ball up here in the bus. I'll get all the players here to sign it for you." So Eric goes over, throws the ball up there, and the ball goes in. The window closes, and now I guess all the players are signing it. But he's gone so long that the mom gets worried that maybe they had stolen his ball and they weren't going to give it back. So she comes over to the bus. Now, of course, remember, she's really beautiful and sexy and everything. And so the players check her out through the window. And then finally the window pops down. They go, "Hey, don't worry, mom. We've all got the ball. The ball. We're just finishing up. We got a few more signatures and then we'll give it back to you." Then they toss the ball out to Eric. It's got some famous names on there like Joe Morgan and Pete Rose. But then they say, "Hey, here's something for your mom," and they throw down a note. And so he's supposed to take the note back to his mom. But before he gets there, he stops to read it. And it says, "I'd like to get to know you. You are muy linda, very beautiful and sexy. I don't speak Spanish very good. Maybe you speak better English, but that's not important. Would you come by tonight and let me buy you a drink?" So even the baseball player's coming on to her. He wants to basically have her come over to the hotel, have a drink. Of course, probably have go up to a hotel room, have sex or whatever. And so Eric's kind of disgusted by this. It's like they're just trying to hit on his mom. Maybe the only reason why they even signed the ball was so that they could get to the mother. I don't know. But there's a phone number and a hotel number and everything's on this note. And as he's walking back, he says Rock was the proudest man, full of joy because he was with her. It was not his fault that he was not an engineer. So he sees his mother with Rock. And I get the sense that he's comparing or contrasting the men on the bus and Uncle Rock. And when he was younger, he probably idolized these baseball players. He thought these baseball stars were what real men. He thought that was what real men are like, kind of worshiping these heroes in sports. But then he looks at the real person, Rock, with his mother, and says it wasn't his fault he was an engineer. And then the voice comes out of the bus and says, "Hey, big guy, give it to her." But instead, he just throws the note on the ground and says by the time he reached his mom and Rock, the note was already somewhere on the asphalt parking lot. And says, "Look," he said, "they signed the ball." And so he goes off with his mother and Uncle Rock and his ball. And so you get a sense that this is kind of a growing up moment where this young, impressionable boy of about 11, who kind of looking for a father figure and seeing all these big, successful celebrities, sports figures, wealthy people, but he starts to come to see Uncle Rock as the true definition of what a good man is. Okay, so that ends then our discussion of these stories, and we have one other section. Now we're going to look at, in the next video next week, we're going to look at a play called A Raisin in the Sun, and we're going to look at a lot of these same family issues played out in the form of a drama.